Order of operations. We're going to first start by defining an exponent. So the definition of an exponent tells us how many times a number is being multiplied by itself. So here's an example. We have 3 and it's raised to the 4th power. So 3 is the base and the exponent is the power that it's raised to. So in this case I have 3 raised to the 4th power, which means I'm taking 3 and I'm multiplying it to itself 4 times. So the rules for order of operation are these. You want to first calculate any type of grouping symbol, parentheses, brackets, or braces, before you do any operations on the outside of those grouping symbols. Once you've cleaned the grouping symbols to be one number, then you want to evaluate any exponents in the problem. Then you're going to do the multiplication and division, and the key note here is you want to work from left to right. So when you're doing order of operations, it's very important that you work left to right when you're working with multiplication and division. And then lastly, you'll have your addition and subtraction, and that you also want to work from left to right. When we talk about exponents and parentheses, so in this case, I have parentheses around a -8. Well, my base here is that parentheses -8, and it's raised to the 2nd power. So what that means is I'm taking that whole thing, the parentheses -8, and multiplying it to itself the number of times of that exponent. So in this case, I end up having 2 as the exponent, so I multiply a -8 parentheses times a -8. So in this case, you see a negative times a negative will give me a positive value, so I end up with a positive 64. But when you have an exponent raised, a number raised to an exponent, but you have a negative with that number, you have to be really careful. If it's not wrapped in parentheses and you just simply have a negative number raised to the 2nd power, that negative does not get applied until after you do the exponent. It's important to understand that that negative is being multiplied to that number, to the power, and that order of operation states you can't multiply until you deal with the power. So in this case, that negative really acts as a -1 being multiplied to that 8 to the 2nd power. So when you do this, it's order of operations, you have to do that exponent first. So you end up with 64, and then you can multiply that negative to your result. So order of operations, in this case, you would have to do the power first and then apply that negative to it. So you end up with a -64 versus a positive 64. So it's really important to notice the difference between these two. If the exponent's on the outside of parentheses and what's inside is a negative, then you're going to be multiplying what's in that parentheses to itself that many times of the exponent. But if there's no parentheses around the number that has a negative, then you have to do the exponent to the number first and then apply the negative to your answer. So it's really important to be able to notice the difference between these two situations. So I'm going to start off with the simple order of operation. So we have this expression here and we need to simplify it. Well, in order to simplify, you always have to think of what needs to be done first. So in this case, it's really important that you notice that there's multiplication in here. So you can't do addition and subtraction if multiplication is in the problem. So the first thing we're going to do is the multiplication. So that 3 is simply going to come down, and I'm going to multiply that -4 to that positive 8, and I'm going to end up with a -32 or -32. Now you can do the addition or subtraction. So keep in mind we have different signs. That 3 is really a positive 3. and you're going to do the subtraction, and you're going to keep the sign of the higher number. So in this case, we end up with a negative 29. Pause and try. You want to make sure that you do that division first. That negative 8's just coming down, and then you do the division, you end up with a negative 8, and then you have the same sign, you're going to add and keep the sign. So this next one has parentheses, multiplication, division. We have multiple steps here to take in order to simplify this expression. So you have to follow order of operations. So the first thing we need to do here is get the parentheses to be one number. So in this case, the first thing we're doing is the different parentheses that we have here. So I'm just bringing down that 7 times 2, and I'm going to clear the parentheses here by doing this operation of addition. So we have 10 plus 2, and I end up with a minus 12, and then I'm bringing down that divided by 3. And then the second parentheses, you have to be careful because you end up with 2 minus 5, and that means you have to subtract and keep the sign of the higher number, so you end up with a negative 3. Now notice here, I brought down the minus sign, and I kept that negative 3 in parentheses. And the reason for that is you need to clearly see we have a double negative here. So it's important that when you're working with parentheses and you end up with a negative number left, keep it in parentheses until you work through the problem. So now we're going to deal with the multiplication and division from left to right. So I'm going to multiply that 7 times 2, and I'm going to get 14, and I'm going to divide the 12 by 3, and I'm going to get a minus 4. And then I'm going to deal with that double negative. And remember, double negative changes to a plus. And now I simply have addition and subtraction from left to right. So I'm going to do that 14 minus 4 is going to give me 10. And then I'm going to do the 10 plus 3, and my answer would be 13. Pause and try. So you see here, when we do the parentheses, inside the parentheses, I ended up with a negative 12. So I'm leaving the parentheses to work out the problem. Then I end up with a positive 4 for the 7 minus 3. Now I'm going to do the multiplication and division from left to right. So I end up with 36 minus a negative 4, because a negative 12 divided by 3 is a negative 4 plus 4. Now keep in mind that double negative, that's going to change to a plus, so it's very important to work the problem from left to right. So now I have 36 plus 4, and then I have 40 plus 4, and my answer would be 44. So now we have a multi-step expression with every step for order of operations. So remember, we're always doing the grouping symbols first. So in this case, I'm going to clear the parentheses. So we're going to end up having 16 divided by, and then we have 8 minus 10. Keep that in parentheses. That's a negative 2. And then I have that power on the outside of the parentheses. And then I have minus, and I end up with 3 minus 6 is a negative 3. So I leave the parentheses, and then I bring down the times 2. So it's really important when you have a negative in the parentheses, when you simplify, make sure the parentheses stay so you can clearly see what operation we're going to end up doing. Now I'm going to deal with that exponent. So this is that example where you have a parentheses around a negative number. Because the parentheses is around that negative number, I need to multiply that parentheses negative 2 times parentheses negative 2. So that's going to end up turning out to be a positive 4. So now I'm just bringing everything else down. Now I'm going to deal with multiplication and division from left to right. So I see here that that negative is really, or that minus is really a negative 1. So when I do this, I'm going to do 16 divided by 4 is 4. Negative 1 times a negative 3. So negative 1 times negative 3 is going to change that to a positive 3, and then times 2. Now I'm going to do that multiplication here, and I have 3 times 2 is 6, and I'm going to do addition and subtraction from left to right, so I end up with 10 as my solution. Pause and try. We're going to work with the order of operations by doing the parentheses first, and hopefully you clearly see that 6 minus 7 is a negative 1. Keep that parentheses around it so that when you apply that exponent, you're multiplying a negative 1 to a negative 1. So we end up with 4 times a positive 1 minus 4 divided by 4. And then I'm going to do the multiplication here. 4 times 1 is 4. 4 divided by 4 is 1. And then I do the subtraction. So my final answer here would be 3. So now you see I have grouping symbols inside of grouping symbols. So you have to get the grouping symbols to be one number before you can remove them. So in this case, I have brackets, and then I have parentheses and an order of operation problem in the brackets. So what's on the outside of the brackets, we will not work with until we get what's inside the bracket to be one number. So it's very important to work that way. So I'm going to just bring down the 3 and the bracket, and I'm going to work inside the bracket and do order of operations. So I'm going to first do the parentheses, and notice that second parentheses has a number attached to it. Well, what that means is once I get the parentheses to be one number, I'm going to end up having multiplication there. So it's very important to leave that 2 attached to whatever you end up with when you do that simplifying of that parentheses. So 4 minus 2, or 4 minus 6 is going to be a negative 2, and then is going to be a negative 4. And notice here that I brought down that 2 attached to that parentheses. Now I can clearly see I have multiplication. So I can't remove the brackets until it's one number. So I'm just going to simply bring down that 3 and that minus sign and the bracket. I'm going to get that multiplication done inside. So I end up having a negative 2 minus 8. Positive 2 times a negative 4 is going to be a negative 8. So I'm bringing down the minus 8. I still need to work to get that bracket to be one number. So the 3 and the minus and the bracket is still coming down. And I'm going to do a negative 2 minus 8, same sign, add and keep the sign. So I end up with a negative 10 in the brackets. Now you can see clearly, if you would remove the brackets, you would not see this double negative. So it's very important that you keep the brackets throughout the problem until you get it to be one number. Now, when we have a double negative, we're going to end up having a positive or a plus. So we have 3 plus 10. So our final answer here would end up being 13. So it's really important to work inside the brackets, get it to be one number before you do anything with the outside. Pause and try. So this is very similar to the example. I'm going to work inside the brackets before I do anything with the outside. So I end up with a negative 2 plus 6 times a negative 2. Then you're going to do that multiplication. I'm just bringing down the 5 minus in the bracket. So I end up having a negative 2 minus 12. I still need to get that bracket to be one number. So I'm just bringing down the 5 minus and bringing the bracket with it. So I end up having a negative 14. Now I see I have a double negative. It's going to change to a plus. And then I do the addition. So you should have gotten 19 here. So we're going to talk about evaluation. Now it's going to be a multiple step evaluation process using order of operations. So evaluation means that you're going to take an algebraic expression and you're going to substitute in numbers for the variables. First you're going to do is replace the variable with the given value. Then you're going to do order of operations. So it's always very important in algebra to make sure that when you're evaluating, you always think of the rules of order of operations. So here's an example here where we're asked to evaluate the expression when x equals 4 and y equals a negative 3. So the first thing you're going to do is plug in the values for the variables into the expression. Notice here when I plugged it in, I used parentheses. And the reason I use parentheses is so I can clearly see that 3 is being multiplied to 4 and that minus 7 is being multiplied to that negative 3. So you have multiplication. So order of operations says I have to do the multiplication first. 3 times 4 is 12. A negative 7 times a negative 3 is going to make that a plus 21. Now I'm going to do the addition, and I end up with 33 as my answer. This next example, it's very important that you follow order of operations. I'm going to substitute in the value of y, and in this case is a negative 3. Notice when I substitute in that negative 3 into y, I used parentheses, and that exponent goes on the outside because I am squaring whatever goes into y. And in this case, I have a negative 3. Now, order of operations, you have to be really careful here. You have to do the exponent first. You have to do the exponent first. You can't multiply that negative 2 to that negative 3 because order of operations states you have to do exponents before you multiply. So very important to think of the process when you're doing evaluation. So I'm going to square that negative 3, and it's going to be a positive 9. Now I can do that multiplication. That negative 2 to positive 9 will end up being a negative 18. So it's very important you think of order of operations when you're dealing with evaluation. Pause and try. So in this case, I substitute it in, I do the multiplication, and then I end up with a negative 2 as my result. Pause and try. Well, this is a multi-step order of operation problem. I substitute in the values for the variables. I need to do that exponent first, and now I'm going to do multiplication and division from left to right. Then you're going to end up having your addition and subtraction. So it's very important that you follow order of operations to get the correct value for your solution. So you should have gotten a negative 3 here. Now I would like you to try a word problem that incorporates order of operation. Pause and try. So in this case, you see that we have every burger cost $8 and every fries cost $3. So if you purchase 6 burgers, you're going to end up having 6 times 8, and 3 fries will be 3 times 3. So to find the total cost, you're going to need to multiply the 6 times 8 and the 3 times 3, and then you're going to need to do addition. So the total cost here would be $57. Pause and try. Very similar to the last example, except for, remember, if we ever have a coupon, that coupon is going to be subtracted from the total. So in this case, I have 3 times 8 for the shirts, 2 times 20 for the pants, and then I'm going to have plus 35, which is the cost of shoes, and then lastly, you want to subtract out the $7 coupon. Order of operations, I'm going to do that multiplication, and then I'm going to do addition and subtraction from left to right. And you should have gotten as your answer $92 spent.